The Zra had conquered 100 worlds without raising a single gun, and Earth, to them, was no different. They had studied humanity with a detached curiosity, watching as it stumbled through its self-made crises, struggling with issues of governance and unity. To the Zra, this species was fragile, divided, and ripe for quiet domination. Subtle manipulation would be all it took to bring the planet to heel. Commander Xeric, a veteran of countless covert conquests, observed Earth from the command deck of his cloaked ship, orbiting silently above the atmosphere. His orders were simple: infiltrate, manipulate, and pacify. Victory would be bloodless, a quiet overtaking from the inside. Over the past few months, his infiltration teams had embedded themselves into key human institutions across the globe: Europe's parliaments, Asia's corporate behemoths, and South America's governments. Everywhere, their tendrils spread unchecked. Xeric allowed himself a moment of pride. Earth would be no different from the others. "We have control over the global media networks, Commander," reported his second-in-command, Lieutenant Threx, his voice calm and efficient. "Within weeks, we will begin the disinformation phase. Humanity will soon be too distracted to notice their own surrender." Xeric nodded, gazing at the holographic display before him. The planet, divided into nations, seemed quaint. "And the United States?" he asked, eyes narrowing at the untouched territory marked on the map. Threx hesitated. "There has been resistance, sir." Xeric's expression darkened. Resistance? From a fractured, undisciplined state? The idea seemed laughable, but Threx's tone was serious. "Explain," Xeric demanded, turning to face his lieutenant fully. "Several of our assets have gone dark. Our operatives embedded in Washington have stopped transmitting, and our attempts to infiltrate their intelligence community have been blocked at every turn. We are receiving reports of alien agents simply vanishing without a trace." Xeric clenched his mandibles in frustration. This was unexpected. The Zra had encountered resistance before, but nothing they couldn't overcome with persistence and deeper infiltration. "Increase efforts," he ordered. "Send a second wave. The Americans are chaotic, but they cannot stand against us once we have control of their data streams and military infrastructure. Press harder." But even as he spoke, a flicker of doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. The Zra had conquered many worlds, but they had never faced an opponent like humanity, a species whose potential was still unfolding. And Americans, in particular, seemed more defiant, more unpredictable than the rest. The next week passed in tense silence. Reports trickled in, each one more troubling than the last. The second wave of operatives never made contact. Entire infiltration cells disappeared, leaving no trace of their work. Xeric's patience wore thin, but he refused to show weakness before his subordinates. "We've lost contact with all assets in the Pentagon," Threx reported grimly, his composure slipping for the first time. "Every attempt to gain control of their systems has been countered, blocked by forces we cannot identify." Xeric leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This is no ordinary resistance. Who is behind this?" "We don't know, sir," Threx admitted, "but it appears that the Americans were expecting us." Xeric stood silently, staring down at the planet that had suddenly become more than just a simple conquest. He had underestimated them. For the first time in decades, doubt crept into his mind. What kind of enemy were they truly facing? "They may not fear us now," Xeric said, voice low and dangerous. "But they will." Commander Xeric paced the length of the command deck, the air thick with tension. The Zra had never faced such a complete and coordinated resistance. It defied all logic. How had the Americans, chaotic and fractured in their political landscape, managed to outmaneuver them? There was no overt military response, no mass mobilization. Instead, their operatives simply vanished, their communications severed. The enemy remained unseen, elusive. "Commander," Lieutenant Threx interrupted, breaking the tense silence. His voice wavered, a rare display of uncertainty. "Our latest reports confirm that the second infiltration wave has also gone dark. We've lost all contact with our embedded agents." Xeric turned sharply, his dark eyes narrowing. "Explain." Threx swallowed, his mandibles twitching. There's no evidence of capture. No signs of struggle. It's as if they simply cease to exist. Worse, sir, we've intercepted fragments of human communications. They're aware of us. The Americans are referring to us as the unseen enemy. Zirich's fists clenched behind his back. How? We've been meticulous. They shouldn't know of our presence. We suspect they've been prepared for something like this, Threx replied. There is mention of a secret organization, an American task force designated to counter non-human threats. They call it the Strategic Defense Unit, SDU. Zirich felt the weight of the situation settle on him. The SDU, an organization he hadn't anticipated. And what do we know of this SDU? Zirich's voice was cold, calculated, but underneath, a crack of unease showed. Threx hesitated. Very little. They operate outside of traditional military chains of command. Covert, highly specialized. They've been systematically dismantling our efforts, using tactics we didn't foresee. Zirich's mind raced. The Zra had faced powerful military foes. But this was something else, something far more insidious. The Americans had built their resistance in the shadows, operating with the same precision the Zra prided themselves on. It was a psychological game now, and one the Americans seemed to be winning. Commander, another officer spoke up, alarm evident in his tone. We've detected breaches in our own communication systems. It appears the humans are actively monitoring us, possibly feeding us false data. Zirich's composure slipped. The humans were toying with them, turning their own methods against them. He felt the walls closing in, the once invisible enemy becoming ever more present, despite remaining unseen. A bitter realization settled in. They weren't hunting the humans anymore. The Americans had set a trap, and the Zra had walked into it blind. We underestimated them, Zirich muttered. A rare admission. They have studied us, learned our ways. Threx nodded, his own fear surfacing. They've been intercepting our agents before we can act. I believe they've embedded countermeasures into their networks for years, waiting for an incursion like ours. Americans, Zirich hissed, spitting the word as if it burned on his tongue. He began pacing again, each step heavier than the last. They had erred in their arrogance. This was not the fractured species they had seen from afar. It was a nation hardened by conflict, deception, and warfare. And now, they were facing an enemy that knew how to fight in the shadows, just as the Zra did. We need to retaliate, Threx suggested. Strike them before they neutralize the rest of our network. No, Zirich snapped. Retaliation without intelligence is suicide. We need to understand them, how they operate, where they hide. Only then can we strike. But even as he spoke, he knew that time was running out. The Americans weren't just stalling. They were systematically disassembling his entire operation. We will find them, Zirich vowed, but his words lacked their usual confidence. The trap had been sprung, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if they could escape it. The room fell silent, the weight of their collective failure pressing down on them. Above Earth, the Zra's invisible armada hovered, suddenly vulnerable in the face of an enemy they couldn't even see. The Zra's once orderly command center had devolved into chaos. Tactical displays flickered with interference. Communications were severed, and the once invincible fleet hanging over Earth was now a silent witness to their unraveling. Commander Zirich stood at the center of the storm, his calm veneer long shattered. The Americans were closing in, and he knew it. Commander, Lieutenant Threx's voice cut through the noise, desperation creeping into his usual stoicism. We've lost all contact with our primary outpost. The humans are disabling our systems, one by one. We're being blinded. Zirich's mandibles tightened. How are they doing this? We still can't locate their forces. They're operating in the shadows. Just as we do, Threx replied, his voice bitter. But they're better at it. The word stung. Zirich had led countless successful covert campaigns, but here on this backward planet, his expertise meant nothing. The humans had adapted to every move, their counterattacks swift and precise. Every hour brought more reports of sabotage, communications hacked, supply chains disrupted, operatives vanishing without a trace. And now, they were out of time. "Commander, I recommend immediate evacuation," Threx urged, his usually steady composure cracking under the weight of their defeat. "We've lost control. Staying here is suicide." But Xerix shook his head. Retreat was not an option. He had already underestimated the Americans once. He would not flee now. They had been hunted like prey, but he was still a predator, and predators did not run. "Prepare our forces," he growled. "We'll make our stand here." The room fell into tense silence as Xerix issued his orders. Outside the ship, the American forces remained invisible, unseen but ever present. Their methods were meticulous. There was no grand invasion, no ships storming the skies. Instead, the humans fought like phantoms, striking at the heart of the Zra's operation with cold precision. It was psychological warfare, and Xerix knew it. They wanted him to panic, to make a mistake. But Xerix was no stranger to fear. He had instilled it in countless enemies. Now, for the first time, he understood it from the other side. "Commander, we're detecting movement in the lower levels of the facility," one of the officers reported, his voice trembling. "I believe the Americans have breached our defenses." Xerix's heart pounded in his chest, a sensation alien to him. It wasn't the humans he feared. It was the unknown. Their strategy was beyond anything he had prepared for. Every attack was silent, every strike calculated. They had never shown themselves, not even once. "Seal the exits," Xerix ordered, though he knew it was futile. The humans were already inside. They had been inside from the start, dismantling his operation from within. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire ship went dark for a moment, then surged back to life. But something was different. The air itself felt colder, heavier. Xerix knew the Americans had taken control. "This is it," Threx muttered, his voice hollow. "They're coming." Xerix faced the darkened corridor leading to the ship's core. He expected a final showdown, something to give him the closure he needed. But the humans didn't fight that way. There would be no face-to-face confrontation, no glorious battle. That wasn't their style. Instead, the walls around him seemed to close in. Every corner, every shadow was filled with the sense of unseen eyes watching. The SD was near, but he would never see them. His defeat was inevitable. "Commander," Threx whispered, his eyes wide with fear, "we have to leave." But it was too late. The final piece of the trap had been set. Xerix's fate had been sealed long before he realized it. The Americans had been toying with him, letting him think he had a chance. In reality, he had been their prey all along. As the doors behind him silently slid open, revealing nothing but darkness, Xerix finally understood the truth. The Americans had become the apex predators. He was no longer the hunter. As the Zra's once mighty invasion force crumbled into the shadows, Commander Xerix's final moments echoed a stark lesson. Strength and power do not always lie in brute force, but in the ability to adapt, to control the unseen, and to exploit the mind. The Americans had embraced this truth, evolving beyond the traditional forms of warfare the Zra had mastered. Their capacity for covert action, psychological manipulation, and silent domination proved far deadlier than any weapon. For the Zra, who had relied on subtle infiltration and manipulation, it was a bitter irony. They had spent lifetimes conquering worlds through subterfuge, only to be outwitted by a species who excelled in those very arts. The humans, fragmented and chaotic on the surface, concealed something far more dangerous beneath, an unyielding resilience, and in the Americans, a ruthless efficiency born from their history of conflict and survival. What the Zra had failed to understand was that humanity's greatest strength wasn't its technology or its military might. It was its unpredictability. In their arrogance, the aliens had assumed they could bend the species to their will, unaware that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. The Americans had been preparing for them, and when the time came, they moved with precision, never revealing themselves, never giving their enemy a chance to strike back. In the end, the Zra learned what many before them had failed to grasp. Humans were predators, but the Americans had become apex predators. Their methods were brutal, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. And by the time their enemies realized it, they were already doomed.